Germany. Winter, 1945. The wind howled across the frozen fields of Bavaria, carrying the faint echo of boots on gravel and the metallic creak of barbed wire. Dawn crept over the horizon, its pale light cutting through a fog that hung like smoke above Stalag 7A, one of the largest prisoner-of-war camps in the Reich. General Wilhelm Kruger, a career officer hardened by 2 wars, walked the perimeter with a cup of steaming black coffee in his gloved hand. The night had been uneventful, or so the guards reported. But as he turned the corner near the American compound, the general stopped cold. Before him stood something that should not have been possible. Under floodlights and watchtowers, with nothing but scrap wood, wire, and frozen mud, the American prisoners had built an entire structure overnight, sturdy, symmetrical, and defiant. A small team of engineers, pilots, and infantrymen had turned debris into a functioning lifeline. Kruger's breath froze in the air as he whispered to his aide, "How in God's name did they build this?" Under our watch? The answer lay not in the tools they used, but in the spirit that refused to surrender. By the winter of 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing under the weight of its own empire. The Wehrmacht was retreating on every front, the Soviets closing in from the east, the Americans and British driving through the west. But deep within Germany's interior, far from the thunder of artillery, a quieter war continued, one fought behind barbed wire and under the watchful eyes of sentries. Across the Reich, hundreds of stalags, for enlisted men, and O-flags, for officers, held more than 90,000 captured American soldiers. They had been taken during the disastrous early months of the European campaign, from North Africa in 1943, from the Normandy hedgerows in 1944, and from the frozen forests of the Ardennes offensive just weeks earlier. Each camp was a world within itself, a fragile ecosystem of exhaustion, discipline, and survival. Stalag 70A, located near Moosburg in Bavaria, was among the largest. Designed to hold 10,000 men, by early 1945 it held nearly 10 times that number. British, French, Polish, Soviet, and American prisoners crammed together in wooden barracks that sagged under the snow. Disease spread easily. Food was a thin soup of turnips and barley. Red Cross parcels, when they came, were torn open and divided with surgical precision. But despite the deprivation, the camp remained organized, especially in the American compound. Within weeks of arrival, the U.S. prisoners had appointed their own internal leadership. Officers were recognized by both the Germans and their fellow inmates, maintaining a semblance of military order. Work details were assigned, rosters kept, sick lists tracked. Even in captivity, the U.S. Army's discipline endured. For the German guards, many of whom were aging veterans or young conscripts, this order among the Americans was both impressive and unsettling. Unlike the broken Soviet prisoners who lay dying in the adjacent fields, the Americans still stood in formation during roll call. They repaired what they could, shared their rations, and even staged makeshift church services. Beneath their calm obedience simmered a quiet defiance, the belief that this war was nearly over, and that they would walk free again. Outside the wire, however, the situation grew desperate. Allied bombers filled the skies daily, reducing rail lines and factories to rubble. The German command feared an uprising, not from civilians but from within their own POW camps. Orders from Berlin demanded stricter discipline, harsher punishments, tighter rations. Yet the guards knew such measures would only drive the prisoners closer together. It was in this atmosphere of tension and exhaustion that the Americans began to build. At first, it was simple survival work, digging drainage trenches to keep the barracks from flooding, repairing roofs with tin salvaged from old food crates, fashioning crude stoves from empty fuel cans. But soon the projects took on a more deliberate character. Engineers and mechanics, once assigned to tank battalions or airfields, began sketching designs in secret, hidden under floorboards or carved into scraps of wood. To the Germans, these men were prisoners. To themselves, they were still soldiers. By mid-February, whispers spread among the guards the Americans were constructing something. But no one could say what. It wasn't an escape tunnel. There was no displaced soil, no suspicious activity near the fences. Yet every morning there was some new sign of progress. Planks aligned, nails straightened, small sections of framework appearing overnight, as if conjured from thin air. General Wilhelm Kruger, newly appointed to oversee several southern camps, received the first report on March 3, 1945. He was skeptical. By then, most officers were focused on the front lines, not on what hungry prisoners were doing with scrap wood. But the pattern was undeniable. American initiative was turning scarcity into strength. In a war increasingly defined by destruction, this quiet construction became an act of rebellion. The Americans' tools were simple: pocket knives, twisted wire, and fragments of steel salvaged from a crashed bomber that had fallen near the camp weeks earlier. Their material came from the camp's own decay: floorboards pulled from ruined barracks, broken furniture, discarded crates. But their method was military: organized shifts, assigned teams, coded signals. Every nail hammered was accounted for, every sound masked beneath the nightly chaos of barking dogs and passing trains. By early March, it was clear they weren't merely repairing their shelters. They were building something new, something that defied every rule of captivity. And as rumors reached the higher command, Kruger himself decided to see what these Americans had been doing in the dead of night. He would come at dawn, and that morning would become one of the most talked about moments in the camp's history. When General Wilhelm Kruger arrived at Stalag 7DOA, the camp was on the brink of collapse, not militarily, but structurally, morally, and humanly. The fences still stood, but the war outside the wire had turned the camp into a warehouse of exhaustion. The commandant's office, a drafty wooden building near the main gate, smelled of coal smoke and damp paper. Inside, reports piled high: shortages, illness, escape attempts, collapsing barracks, and the ever-present problem of morale among both prisoners and guards. By March 1945, the camp held over 80,000 men, far beyond its capacity. Entire compounds were flooded with mud and snowmelt. The guards themselves lived scarcely better, surviving on half rations and hoped that the war might somehow end before their country did. Kruger, a soldier of the old Prussian school, believed in efficiency. He had served in Poland and on the Eastern Front, where the chaos of war had broken even the most rigid order. Yet what he saw among the American prisoners contradicted everything he expected from men in captivity. The Americans were disciplined, coordinated, and strangely productive. They maintained a functioning internal structure: an elected camp leader, section heads, medical staff, and even a system of mess organization that rivaled small military units. They operated under the Geneva Convention's allowance for internal self-governance, something the Germans tolerated only so long as order was preserved. But Kruger noticed something else. Despite their ration shortages and poor tools, the American section of the camp looked almost maintained. Their barracks stood straighter. Their pathways were cleared. Their latrines, primitive though they were kept cleaner than those of the guards. Beneath their rough discipline, there was a sense of quiet American practicality. That practicality had deep roots. Many of the captured men were engineers, construction workers, mechanics, or architects in civilian life. When they were drafted, they brought their hands-on ingenuity with them to Europe. In captivity, that same skill set became a weapon, not of destruction but of survival. The first American prisoners had arrived at Stalag 7DA in late 1943, captured during the Italian campaign. By 1945, their numbers had swelled after the Battle of the Bulge, when German forces captured entire regiments during the surprise Ardennes offensive. Those new arrivals, many from armored and airborne divisions, carried a different attitude: younger, bolder, less resigned. To them, captivity was just another challenge to overcome. They began organizing covert projects within the camp, some focused on escape, building dummy tunnels or creating fake uniforms from scavenged cloth. But others turned their energy toward construction, not destruction. One such effort started with a simple need: water. The camp's supply system was collapsing, and pipes often froze solid. The prisoners began collecting rainwater using improvised gutters fashioned from flattened tin cans. They built drainage ditches that doubled as camouflage for small underground workshops, hidden places where prisoners could repair boots, tools, and even radios. By early 1945, they had developed a quiet network of resource sharing. A downed Allied airman might provide knowledge of electrical circuits. An infantry carpenter might scavenge wood from an abandoned guard hut. A British prisoner might barter nails or rope from another compound. Slowly, an invisible factory emerged, under the noses of the guards. The German officers had long underestimated the ingenuity of Allied prisoners. Their attention was fixed on preventing escapes, not monitoring carpentry. But under cover of routine maintenance, the Americans were doing something extraordinary. They weren't just building to endure the winter. They were building a statement, a testament to their unity, identity, and willpower. Kruger's aide described it in his report as an unauthorized construction within the prisoner sector, of uncertain function. The structure was being assembled near the far fence line, behind a row of barracks marked as uninhabitable. The prisoners had requested permission to reinforce roofs to prevent collapse, permission granted without suspicion. Within 2 weeks, the so-called roof repairs had turned into a full-fledged project. Frameworks appeared under tarps. Teams rotated through night shifts. Even the guards began to suspect something larger was taking shape. Yet no one had seen it completed, not until the morning of Kruger's inspection. What he discovered would later circulate among German officers as an example of enemy spirit. To some, it was infuriating, a sign that even captivity couldn't crush Allied morale. To others, including Kruger himself, it was a quiet lesson in what separated will from obedience. By March's final days, Allied forces were crossing the Rhine. The thunder of distant artillery sometimes reached Moosburg at night, echoing through the barracks like a promise. The prisoners knew liberation was near, yet they kept building not out of necessity, but because they needed to prove, even for one more night, that they were still soldiers of the United States Army. When dawn came, their work stood complete, a silent monument of resistance inside enemy wire. And as the general's boots crunched toward it that icy morning, the story of what the Americans built overnight was about to unfold. To understand why what the Americans built astonished a German general, one must first grasp the mindset of the captured soldier, particularly the American soldier of 1945. In the final months of the war, American POWs were no longer fresh recruits stunned by capture. Many were veterans of multiple campaigns, men who had seen cities burn and divisions dissolve. They were not resigned captives. They were professionals who believed in problem-solving, improvisation, and initiative. The U.S. Army culture of make it work did not stop at the prison gate. Inside the wire, this culture became their greatest weapon. Unlike in totalitarian systems, where obedience was absolute, American troops had been trained to think independently. Non-commissioned officers were accustomed to taking initiative, and engineers were used to solving field problems with limited resources. When the Germans stripped them of weapons, they hadn't stripped them of knowledge. And in a prison camp where every nail was precious, knowledge became power. The Americans learned early that survival depended on self-organization. Hunger, cold, and boredom were as deadly as bullets. So they recreated what they knew best: structure. Every task had a leader, every group a purpose. Some focused on sanitation, others on cooking or repair. Within weeks, the camp began to resemble a small, functioning town. To German guards raised in a rigid hierarchy, this self-motivated order seemed unnatural. Prisoners were supposed to wait for orders to obey out of fear. Yet these men obeyed their own officers. Captivity without chaos. It puzzled and at times unsettled the camp command. By early March 1945, this order had evolved into something greater: collective ingenuity. With nothing more than discarded wood, twisted wire, and ration tins, the Americans began to construct what they called the shed. It started as an effort to protect men from rain, but the plan soon expanded. What they were truly building was an improvised workshop and heating system, designed to channel warmth to multiple barracks, a primitive, hand-built central furnace. The logic was simple. The camp's German heating system had collapsed. Fuel was scarce, and guards prioritized their own quarters. In sub-zero conditions, frostbite claimed toes, then feet. The Americans decided to solve it themselves. They dug shallow trenches beneath the snow, lined them with tin and clay, and routed smoke pipes made from scavenged cans. Above ground, they built a small hut around the central fire chamber, concealed as a maintenance shed. To an untrained eye, it looked like little more than a pile of patched planks. But beneath it ran an entire network of improvised air channels, distributing heat to 3 neighboring barracks. Overnight, Men who had been shivering for weeks felt warmth on the wooden floors for the first time. When General Kruger saw it, he didn't just see a shed, he saw a system. And that was what unsettled him most. He recognized design, calculations, teamwork. He realized that even stripped of tools, uniform and rank, these men had rebuilt a miniature version of the Army Corps of Engineers, under guard, in the dead of winter with nothing but trash. From a tactical perspective, it revealed something far more profound about Allied training. German doctrine prized discipline and centralized control. American doctrine prized initiative and flexibility. This difference, visible on battlefields from Normandy to the Ardennes, now manifested behind barbed wire. Even in captivity, American soldiers applied military thinking to every problem. Assess, plan, execute. For the Guards, it was both fascinating and dangerous. A group capable of constructing a hidden furnace could also build an escape tunnel or weapon. Yet punishing them risked chaos at a time when the German army could barely control its own ranks. So the command staff turned a blind eye, a pragmatic choice born from desperation. Humanly, however, what they built symbolized something deeper. It was hope made physical. Every plank hammered, every pipe aligned was a declaration that they still mattered, that they still had purpose. For months, these men had been stripped of identity, reduced to numbers on rosters. But that night, as they worked in silence, each man became a soldier again. They built with the same precision they once brought to field operations, driven not by orders but by shared will. One American sergeant, whose hands had been frostbitten beyond healing, reportedly supervised the construction using a stick as a pointer, tracing designs in the snow. His men followed wordlessly in the dark, shoveling, hammering, lifting. When the fire first caught in the chamber beneath the shed, a faint orange glow spread under the barracks floorboards. For a moment, the prisoners felt something more powerful than warmth. They felt victory. To Kruger, this was the most astonishing revelation of all. He had fought on 3 fronts, seen tanks burn and cities crumble, but he had never witnessed defiance so quiet, so organized, and so human. There were no banners, no speeches, no disobedience, just the unspoken message that no prison could truly contain the will to create. In a war defined by destruction, the Americans had built something life-giving, and they had done it with nothing but faith in one another. From the German side of the wire, the Americans' construction was more than puzzling. It was psychologically disarming. For years, German officers had been trained to view Allied prisoners through a prism of superiority, believing discipline, precision, and obedience were uniquely German virtues. But in camps like Stalag 7A, that illusion began to crack. Behind fences, in mud and hunger, the enemy was mirroring their own military virtues, sometimes with even greater cohesion. General Wilhelm Kruger was among those who sensed the deeper meaning of what he witnessed. He was not a fanatic. His uniform bore the ironed creases of an officer from another era, a soldier who still clung to the traditions of order and professionalism, even as the Third Reich descended into chaos. For men like Kruger, the Americans represented a paradox, an army both young and undisciplined in appearance, yet strategically sophisticated and morally unbroken. When he first walked the American compound, Kruger saw men in patched coats and torn gloves, but their eyes met his with the same calm he had once seen among his own engineers before a major operation. There was no hatred, no submission, just an unmistakable quiet confidence. The sight of the overnight structure and the so-called maintenance shed only amplified that impression. To Kruger, it symbolized what Germany was losing, the will to build while under pressure, to create order amid collapse. His own men had stopped believing months ago. They obeyed, yes, but without conviction. The guards were weary, the sergeants cynical, the younger soldiers dreaming only of surrender. Yet here were captured enemies, unstarved, unarmed, humiliated, who somehow found the strength to construct, organize, and hope. That psychological contrast haunted many German officers in the war's final months. By early 1945, the moral inversion of the conflict was complete. The Reich, once boasting about discipline and unity, was now crumbling from within, while the Allies, even in captivity, displayed the very order Germany had claimed as its birthright. For the guards at Stalag 7A, this was a quiet humiliation. They watched the Americans operate almost like a small company, each man contributing to a purpose larger than himself. German sentries whispered about how the prisoners had scavenged and built through the night without being seen. Some admired it. Others feared it. They wondered what else might be hiding beneath those barracks floors. To the Nazi political officers, however, this display of ingenuity carried a dangerous symbolism. The party demanded total control over morale, even within POW camps. Any sign of autonomy, even constructive autonomy, was seen as a threat to authority. But by March 1945, control was slipping everywhere. Orders were delayed, supply lines severed, and many local commanders had begun to act on instinct rather than ideology. Kruger, though loyal to duty, was pragmatic enough to see the futility of punishing creativity when his own army could barely heat its barracks, so he ordered the project to stand. He even authorized additional lumber for repair purposes, knowing full well that the Americans would use it to reinforce their creation. To his subordinates, this bordered on sympathy. But Kruger understood something they did not. The camp was a mirror of the war itself. The side that could still build, still innovate, even in captivity, had already won in spirit. Morally, the event also exposed the complex humanity that lingered beneath the brutality of total war. The Germans, for all their doctrine of obedience, were still men capable of admiration. One guard, interviewed decades later, described the moment he first saw the Americans' furnace system in operation. It was unbelievable. We had engineers at home who could not build such a thing without tools, and yet these prisoners with nothing made warmth where there was none. I felt ashamed and proud, both at once. That duality defined the late war psychology of Germany. Many officers were torn between ideology and respect for their adversaries. For years they had been told that the Allies were soft, too democratic, too undisciplined, too indulgent. But what they saw behind the fences of Moosburg contradicted every propaganda poster. The Americans were resourceful, united and unbreakable. Kruger, though he never said it aloud, understood that this ingenuity was a reflection of the system that produced it. A democracy that valued initiative, where authority was earned, not imposed. He compared it silently to the collapsing Wehrmacht, whose soldiers waited endlessly for orders that never came. There was also an emotional angle, one that few admitted. Some German guards began helping the prisoners discreetly, passing along nails, tools, or discarded materials. Acts that could have been punished as collaboration. It wasn't sympathy. It was respect born of exhaustion. In a war where everything was falling apart, seeing something, anything, built was an act of shared humanity. By the time the structure stood complete, it had become a symbol of survival for both sides. For the Americans, it was proof of resilience. For the Germans, it was a reminder of what they had lost, their own sense of unity and creativity. And for Kruger, it became something deeper still. He saw in that improvised furnace a kind of requiem for the Germany he once served, a nation of builders, now consumed by destruction. As he turned from the site that morning, frost glinting off the tin and wire, he ordered his aide not to interfere. "Let it stand," he said quietly. "They have earned it." That decision would mark the beginning of the camp's final chapter, one that unfolded just weeks before the U.S. Army arrived at the gates. The night it happened was one of the coldest of that final winter. March 5, 1945. A moonless sky. The camp buried beneath a hard crust of snow, the kind that swallowed footsteps and muffled sound. Beyond the perimeter fence, artillery flashes flickered faintly from the west, silent lightning marking the distant advance of Patton's Third Army. Inside Stalag 7A, the air was still, the guards' watchfires burning low. The prisoners had been preparing for weeks. Every plank, every nail, every scrap of wire had been gathered slowly, deliberately, piece by piece, traded or stolen under the pretense of repairs. The design had been drawn in charcoal on the back of a Red Cross parcel lid, passed hand to hand, memorized, then burned. There could be no trace. The Americans knew they had one chance. Their plan depended on timing, silence, and the willingness of dozens of men to work in perfect coordination under the eyes of armed sentries. At 21 hours, the signal went out. A single tin cup dropped from a barrack step. The sound rehearsed so often it had become code. Within minutes, movement began in every corner of the compound. Men slipped from their bunks, crawling through the shadows between huts. Those on watch duty at the perimeter coughed loudly, covering the noise of hammering. Others began singing softly, low rhythmic humming that masked the metallic rasp of saw blades. The guards, exhausted and half-frozen, heard only what they expected, the restless shifting of prisoners unable to sleep. In the center of the compound, a narrow trench had already been dug. It ran beneath 3 barracks, invisible from the towers. The men had lined it with clay and tin, building a crude heat channel. At its heart, they assembled the furnace chamber, a compact structure of brick fragments, mud and stone scavenged from the camp's periphery. It was held together not by mortar, but by frost and faith. By midnight, the skeleton of the shed stood above it, uneven planks joined with wire and stripped nails, roof patched with tar paper and old canvas. The entire thing leaned slightly, like a relic of exhaustion. Yet every joint, every angle had been calculated. It was meant to look accidental, unfinished, unimportant. Inside, the men worked with the concentration of a bomb squad. A single spark in the wrong place could betray them. But the real danger was time. The night guard changed shifts at 03:00, bringing fresh eyes. If they weren't finished by then, the project, and their illusion of obedience would be destroyed. One of the prisoners, an engineer from Pennsylvania named Lieutenant Howard, crawled beneath the structure with a tin of embers. His hand shook not from fear but from the cold that had long since bitten through his gloves. Around him, others whispered measurements, checking the air channels that led under the barracks. Each was packed with earth and stones to trap heat. At 02:40, the first test began. A tiny flame flickered inside the chamber, feeding on splinters of crate wood. Smoke began to rise, thin, uncertain, curling up through the shed roof's cracks. For a terrible moment, the men froze. A tower searchlight swept past, lighting the snow like daylight. They waited, breathless. The beam lingered, then moved on. The fire held. The system worked. Heat began to travel along the channels, seeping beneath the barracks floors. For the first time in months, the frost underfoot began to melt. Men who had been asleep woke to the faint sensation of warmth, confused, disbelieving. By 03:15, the night shift had changed. The guards in the towers yawned, stamping their feet to stay awake. They noticed nothing unusual, except perhaps the faint smell of smoke, which they assumed came from the guards' own huts near the gate. At 04:00, the final panel of the shed was fastened into place. The structure was finished. Dozens of prisoners stood in silence, staring at what they had done. A building born not of orders but of unity. No one spoke. No one dared. They simply nodded to one another and melted back into the shadows of their barracks. By dawn, all that remained was the faint glow of heat beneath the snow and the crooked outline of a new structure standing where none had been the night before. At 06:30, the German guards spotted it during roll call. Confused, they reported it to the officer on duty, who dismissed it as camp maintenance. But when General Kruger arrived for inspection later that morning, curiosity led him toward the new addition. The path to the American compound was silent except for the crunch of his boots. Frost glittered on the barbed wire. Crows perched on the towers like sentinels. The general paused before the shed, his breath turning to mist. He studied it. The rough seams, the improvised joints, the faint warmth radiating from within. He reached out and touched the wood. It was warm. For a long time, Kruger said nothing. His aide waited, notebook in hand, expecting an order to dismantle it, to punish the builders, to restore authority. But the general only stepped back, eyes narrowing in thought. He understood immediately that this was no escape tunnel, no act of sabotage. It was something far more dangerous to tyranny, proof of unbroken spirit. What stood before him was not merely a shed. It was a declaration. And that realization, in the cold silence of dawn, marked the true turning point, both for the camp and for the man who commanded it. When the morning horn sounded, its metallic cry cut through the cold like a blade. The prisoners emerged from their barracks in silence, their breath rising in plumes against the pale Bavarian sky. The sun had not yet broken the horizon, and the camp still glowed faintly with the warmth that had spread through the night. Warmth no one could quite explain. The guards noticed it first. The frost had melted in a perfect arc along the central lane. forming muddy rivulets that traced toward the new structure, the shed that had appeared as if conjured from the dark. Inside the command hut, confusion simmered. Reports from the sentries were contradictory. Some claimed the Americans had worked all night. Others swore they'd seen nothing. The floodlights had revealed no movement, the patrol logs no infractions. Yet somehow, before dawn, an entire building had risen from the ground. General Kruger arrived shortly after roll call, his uniform immaculate, his eyes cold as flint. He dismissed the guards with a curt gesture and walked straight to the new structure. The prisoners watched from a distance, held in formation under the rifles of nervous sentries. The general crouched beside the shed, running a gloved hand along the wall. The wood was uneven, splintered, but warm. Beneath it he could hear a faint, steady hum, not machinery but air moving through hidden channels. He looked down, noticing small gaps between the boards where smoke drifted upward in thin, whispering lines. He ordered the door opened. Inside, the air shimmered with heat. A makeshift furnace burned quietly at the center, feeding on sawdust, wood, and bits of coal scavenged from the guards' refuse. It was ingeniously constructed, primitive but efficient. A labyrinth of tunnels beneath the floor vented the warmth throughout the surrounding barracks. Kruger stepped inside, the heat soaking into his coat. Around him the structure creaked softly, alive with the pulse of fire. He felt the weight of something he hadn't felt in years, awe. He turned to his aide. "Who built this?" The young officer hesitated. "The Americans, Herr General, but we don't know who led them." Kruger's gaze drifted across the camp where hundreds of men now stood in perfect stillness, watching him. He knew that in every face, and hungry, hollow yet unbroken, there was an answer. He could order an investigation. He could tear the structure down. He could punish them all. But as he looked back at the fire flickering inside that small, defiant shed, something within him shifted. This was not rebellion. It was resilience, a quiet refusal to die in despair. Kruger removed his gloves, extended his hands toward the heat, and for a brief, dangerous moment, a German general stood inside an American creation and felt human again. Outside, the guards waited for his command. The prisoners, tense and motionless, watched the smoke curl from the chimney, each second stretching like an eternity. Finally, Kruger stepped out. His face was unreadable, his voice calm. "Leave it," he said simply. "No one touches it." The words rippled through the compound like an electric current. Guards exchanged startled glances. The prisoners, hardened men who had endured frostbite, starvation, and humiliation, stood in stunned silence. Kruger turned, his boots crunching on the frozen earth, and added over his shoulder, "Even in captivity, men must have warmth." It was the closest thing to mercy anyone had ever heard in that place. From that day forward, the shed was never questioned again. The guards avoided it. The officers pretended it didn't exist. But every night, the faint orange glow from its cracks stretched across the snow, like a heartbeat in the dark. The Americans took shifts tending the fire. They repaired the channels when they froze, rationed fuel, and whispered around its warmth as if gathered in a church. Some told stories of home, of Texas fields, Chicago streets, or quiet farms in Vermont. Others simply sat in silence, staring into the flames, their faces softening in the light. Even some of the German guards, in the weeks that followed, began lingering closer to the fence at night, drawn by the warmth that spilled into the air. No one spoke of it. No one dared. But in that strange, unspoken truce, something changed. It was no longer just a camp of prisoners and captors. It had become a fragile island of men, all waiting for the war to end, all pretending not to share the same cold, the same hunger, the same fear of tomorrow. One evening near the end of March, Kruger stood alone in his office, staring out the frost-bitten window. Distant thunder echoed from the west, not weather but artillery. The Americans were coming. He knew it was only a matter of days. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper, a diagram, rough and faded, that one of his engineers had confiscated from the American barracks. It showed the furnace design, sketched with astonishing precision. At the bottom, in small block letters, were the words, "For all of us." Kruger stared at it for a long time, then slipped it into his desk drawer. When the U.S. tanks finally rolled through Moosburg and the gates of Stalag 7A were thrown open in April 1945, the shed still stood, battered, smoke-stained, but intact. One of the first American officers to enter the camp found General Kruger standing near it, unarmed, waiting. He didn't resist. He only gestured toward the structure and said quietly, "Your men built that. You should keep it." April 29, 1945, Moosburg, Bavaria. The gates of Stalag 7 swung open under the thunder of tank treads and the clatter of boots. The men of the 14th Armored Division, the Liberators, advanced through the barbed wire in disbelief. Before them stretched a sea of men, tens of thousands in tattered uniforms, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow yet burning with sudden unreal light. The camp that had held over 80,000 Allied prisoners, Americans, British, Canadians, French, and others, was finally free. But liberation in that moment was not celebration. It was silence. Many prisoners did not cheer. They simply stared. Some fell to their knees. Others saluted the tanks as if unsure whether to believe they were real. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, mud, and the faint trace of that one familiar scent, wood burning. The small shed still stood near the center of the camp, its chimney cracked but warm, the last fire inside barely alive. The American officers walked toward it, their boots crunching on the frost-bitten earth. Behind them, prisoners followed in slow waves, cautious, reverent, as though approaching a grave. Inside the structure, they found the remnants of the makeshift furnace, the melted metal grate, the stone-lined tunnel, the ash. But it was not ruin. It was testament. They recognized it immediately. The design, the craftsmanship, the unmistakable mark of their own ingenuity under impossible conditions. Word spread quickly. They built it overnight. The Germans didn't destroy it. It kept hundreds alive. Among the liberated soldiers was Lieutenant Henry Larkin, one of the engineers who had drawn the furnace design in secret months earlier. He stood before the shed in silence, his uniform hanging loose on his thin frame. Eyes fixed on the soot-stained boards, he whispered. They left it standing. Nearby, medics worked tirelessly, distributing rations, cutting open crates of medical supplies, trying to triage men on the edge of death. But amidst the chaos, a quiet order was issued. Don't burn it down. Don't tear it apart. Leave it. The decision came from the highest American officers on site. It was not about the wood or the structure. It was about what it meant, what it symbolized. When the prisoners were evacuated, the engineers stayed behind briefly, recording every detail: dimensions, material, airflow, layout. They measured the heat tunnels, photographed the cracks, and traced the angles of the roof beams. What they documented was more than survival. It was a blueprint of hope forged in captivity. The German guards were rounded up and disarmed. Most offered no resistance. Many looked visibly relieved. The war was ending, and with it the weight of years spent serving a collapsing regime. General Wilhelm Kruger was found inside his office, sitting at his desk. The diagram of the furnace lay folded neatly before him. He did not attempt to flee. When the American officers entered, he stood, removed his cap, and surrendered it wordlessly. Colonel James Parker, commanding the lead unit of the 14th Armored, noticed the paper. "What's that?" he asked. Kruger hesitated, then handed it over. "Something your men built," he said quietly. "They used nothing but scraps and stubbornness. I thought you might want it returned." Parker studied the crude drawing, the cross-section of the furnace, the hand-drawn vents, the faint writing at the bottom. For a moment, the colonel said nothing. Then, folding the paper with care, he nodded once. "You treated them fairly?" Kruger's answer was measured. "As fairly as war allows." The colonel met his gaze. Two men from opposing sides, separated by ideology but bound by exhaustion. There was no hatred, only understanding. Within hours, Kruger and his officers were taken into custody. He did not resist, did not speak again, but before leaving he turned once toward the shed. His expression, caught by one of the army photographers, would later become a haunting image. A German general standing in front of an American-built structure. His eyes lowered not in shame, but in remembrance. The liberation of Stalag 7A revealed a humanitarian crisis. Thousands were malnourished, ill, or near death. The Allied command organized immediate relief. Field kitchens, medical tents, evacuation convoys. Yet among the horror, small acts of decency emerged. German doctors who treated Allied prisoners, guards who shared rations when the Reich's supply lines failed, prisoners who kept each other alive with stolen bread and whispered prayers. Amid these stories, the tale of the overnight furnace, the midnight shed as the soldiers later called it, spread through the camp like a sacred rumor. By the time the war ended, it had become more than an event. It was a metaphor, a story passed from man to man, division to division, of American ingenuity under duress, of survival without surrender, of one night when creation triumphed over captivity. When the engineers returned to the United States months later, some carried fragments of the original structure with them: charred wood, a metal hinge, a piece of the vent. One fragment, carefully labeled and stored, ended up at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Museum decades later. Another fragment vanished into private hands, passed down through families of former POWs, and somewhere in Bavaria, long after the camp was dismantled and the land reclaimed by grass and trees, the faint outline of the furnace's foundation still lingered, visible only when the frost melted just right in early spring. It became a quiet pilgrimage site for some who remembered. Not grand, not marked by any plaque, just a scar in the soil warmed by memory. But the true aftermath of that night was not in the ground. It was in the men who lived through it. They had seen the worst of humanity and yet built something good. They had turned debris into fire, captivity into creation, and despair into design. It was proof that even behind barbed wire the human spirit could still build, even when it could no longer fight. In the months following the liberation of Stalag 7-Day, the Allied command began the monumental task of cataloging every detail of the camp. Names, ranks, causes of death, acts of cruelty, and occasionally acts of compassion. Among the hundreds of reports that crossed the desks of investigators, one stood out. A brief, handwritten statement from several American engineers and infantrymen titled simply, "The Furnace We Built." It described how, on a night in February 1945, a small group of U.S. prisoners, former engineers, mechanics and carpenters, had used scrap wood, broken piping, and pieces of barbed wire to construct a functioning heating system in less than 12 hours. It was not an act of rebellion, but of survival. The statement ended with one line that drew attention even from senior officers. "We built it not to defy, but to remind ourselves that we still could." That single sentence would later appear in post-war newspapers, engineering journals, and even in testimonies before Allied tribunals, not as evidence of resistance but of resilience. It was a reminder that humanity's most defining moments often emerge in its darkest hours. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers analyzed the design in the summer of 1945, impressed by its simplicity and effectiveness. According to their report, the system could heat multiple barracks simultaneously with minimal fuel consumption, a remarkable feat given the constraints of captivity. What astonished them even more was the teamwork behind it: officers, enlisted men, pilots, and medics working side by side without rank or distinction. For them, the overnight furnace became a teaching case, not just of engineering under duress, but of leadership through cooperation. One colonel overseeing the evaluation wrote in his memo, "They had no tools, no resources, and no freedom, only will." That was enough. Years later, in the early 1950s, a young cadet at West Point would study that same report in an ethics class titled "Courage Beyond Combat." The lesson was not about the furnace itself, but about what it represented: the ability to act with purpose when hope seems irrelevant. Meanwhile, across a divided Germany, the story followed a quieter path. General Wilhelm Kruger, now a prisoner himself under Allied custody, was held in a British-run internment camp near Hamburg. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not